My father picked the poorest man in Millbrook to marry me off to, and he called it a mercy. 11 years later, he sat at that same poor man's kitchen table and asked him for $42,000. I didn't need a calculator to notice he'd never once used the word loan back when it started. Standing at my own stove with my back to both of them, I already knew exactly why he'd driven 40 minutes out to Sourwood Pike on a Tuesday morning instead of calling first. What my father never bothered to learn about me in 32 years is that I don't throw things away. Not papers, not receipts, not proof that outlives an argument. Welcome back. I'm Claire, 32, and for most of my adult life I've been the one who keeps the books, in my marriage and out of it. If you've ever been the family's afterthought right up until the day you weren't, pull up a chair. This one's for you. Drop a comment. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because there is a lot more to this story than $42,000. My mother stood in my kitchen that morning in a blazer that still had the tag folded up inside the cuff, like she bought it that same week, and hadn't decided yet whether she was keeping it. She kept running her hand along the granite counter the way you'd touch something in a store you weren't sure you could afford. My father sat at the head of the table, hands folded the way he used to fold them right before explaining a policy deductible, the posture he uses when he needs a room to believe him. My husband, Eli, stood by the mudroom door in his work boots, arms crossed, quiet, because Eli has never once needed to talk fast to be believed. I didn't flinch when my father said the number. I want to be honest about that much, because it would make a better story if I had. But to understand why I already knew, you'd need to go back to a Tuesday in July, 11 years ago, when I was 21 years old, and my mother told me that marrying a man I'd met exactly twice was the only apology I had left to give his family. Millbrook, Tennessee is the kind of town where everybody knows which pew is yours whether you show up or not. My father, Walter Danvers, ran Danvers Insurance and bond out of a brick storefront on Main Street that his own father had opened in 1961, and he was the sort of man who shook your hand a half-second too long so you'd remember it. My mother, Diane, sat on the flower committee at First Baptist and could tell you, without checking, whose casserole dish was whose at any funeral in the county. I was the younger of 2 daughters. My sister Paige was 2 years ahead of me in every category that mattered to my parents. Homecoming court, a business degree from a school with a football team people had actually heard of, and eventually a husband named Bradley, who wore his bank badge on a lanyard like a medal. Paige got a brand new Civic for her 16th birthday. I got my grandmother's old Buick 2 years later, 90-some thousand miles on it, and a check engine light that never once went dark, and I never once heard anyone in my family call that a difference worth mentioning. I was the daughter who liked numbers more than parties, who balanced the church bulletins offering totals as a favor at 15 because nobody else wanted the job, and who my mother introduced, more than once, as my other one. I don't say that looking for sympathy. I say it because it matters later. Nobody in my family ever worried about losing me. They just assumed I'd always be there to be useful. The trouble, if you want a single starting point, began the spring I turned 21, when my father's longtime office manager, a woman named Carol and Mies who'd worked there since before I was born, got caught writing herself checks out of the escrow account. $61,000, a little at a time, over almost 4 years. It takes real patience to steal that quietly. It wasn't technically my father's money. It was premium money that belonged to clients until it reached its destination. And when the bonding company found the gap, they gave him 30 days to make it whole or lose a license his own father had held for 4 decades. My father did not have 30 days worth of anything. What he had was a friend. Everett Pruitt owned 260 acres out on Sourwood Pike, land his family had worked since before Millbrook had its first stoplight, and Everett kept money the old way. Some of it literally in a lockbox, because he'd watched a bank fail once as a boy and never fully trusted one again after that. My father drove out there on a Thursday night and came home with $42,000 in a grocery sack, most of it counted out across 2 sittings at Everett's kitchen table because Everett wanted to see the bills himself before he handed $1 of it over. My father made his agency whole with 2 days to spare. Outside our 2 families, almost nobody in Millbrook ever learned how close Danvers Insurance came to closing its doors, and my father worked hard to keep it that way. I didn't know any of this yet, not the real shape of it. I was 21 that spring, and more worried about a boy named Marcus Doyle, who worked at his uncle's tire shop and drove a Nissan with a check engine light that matched mine. We weren't reckless. We were careful the way 21-year-olds think they're being careful, which is to say, not particularly. In April, a woman from the church named Verna Sutcliffe saw my car parked behind the Tasty Freeze on a Wednesday night when I was supposed to be at Bible study, and by Thursday afternoon my mother knew, and by Thursday evening, so did her whole garden club. Nothing scandalous happened behind that Tasty Freeze, for the record. We split an order of onion rings and talked for an hour. But in my mother's circle, being seen mattered more than anything that actually happened. The truth of a thing never carried half the weight of who'd witnessed it. 4 months after that, my mother punished me in the quiet ways she's always been best at. She stopped introducing me to people. She let conversations end the second I walked into a room. Then in July, my father sat me down at the kitchen table with a manila folder I assumed held bills, and told me, in the exact voice he used to explain a deductible, that Everett Pruitt's son Eli was looking to marry and start his own household on the family land, and that our two families had already discussed it and agreed it made good sense for everyone. I asked him what, exactly, made sense about it. He said I'd cost this family enough for 1 year, and it was time I did something that helped it instead. My mother, at the sink with her back to me, added that Everett Pruitt had kept this family standing when it mattered, and the least I could do was put on a dress and say thank you with my own 2 feet at an altar. Neither of them used the word debt. Neither of them needed to. I understood, in the vague, sick way you understand things nobody will explain to you directly, that I was being used to settle something, and that objecting would only prove I really was as selfish as they'd already decided I was. I met Eli twice before the wedding. Once at a Sunday dinner where he barely said 10 words, and once alone at my own request, at a diner off Route 411, where I told him flatly that I didn't know what our parents had told him, and I wanted to hear his version instead. He looked at me for a long moment before he answered. I know this wasn't your idea, he said. Wasn't all mine either, if I'm honest. But 2 people can still decide together what happens next, even if neither of us got a say in how it started. It wasn't romantic. It was the most honest sentence anyone had said to me in months, and I have never once forgotten it. The wedding, that October, was small in a way that had nothing to do with taste and everything to do with my mother deciding I hadn't earned a real one. We held it at the Pruitt farmhouse instead of a church. 20-some folding chairs set up on the grass, a sheet cake from the grocery store in Cornersville, because my mother wouldn't call the bakery she used for occasions that counted. She cried through the vows, and for longer than I should have, I let myself believe that was sentiment. I understand now it was grief for the wedding she thought I owed her and didn't get to throw. Paige gave a toast that managed to congratulate me and pity me inside the same 6 sentences. Afterward, my father shook Eli's hand loud enough for the row behind him to hear and said, "Well, she's somebody's responsibility now," like I was a piece of furniture he'd finally managed to move out of his house. I moved into a farmhouse with no central air and a bathtub older than my mother, married to a man I'd had exactly 3 real conversations with, and I remember standing in that kitchen on my first night there thinking, with a strange, flat clarity, that I had officially become the debt my father owed. That was the whole shape of it. Not a marriage. A settlement. Here's the part my family never once bothered to ask about in 11 years. What actually happened after the folding chairs got put away. Eli Pruitt turned out to be nothing like the joke my mother made him into at dinner parties, back when she still mentioned me at those dinner parties at all. He was up before 5 every morning without needing an alarm clock. He read everything he could get his hands on about soil health, about rotational grazing, about the sourwood trees that grew wild through the back 40 acres his own father had always dismissed as just shade. He didn't have much, but what he did have, he took care of, down to the oil changes on a truck older than our marriage. That first winter was the hardest of my life, and I say that as someone who grew up comfortable, which made it worse in its own way, because I had no calluses built up for it yet. The farmhouse leaked heat out of every window frame. We lived off a chest freezer full of a steer Everett had slaughtered in November and a garden his wife, Loretta, had spent all summer putting up in mason jars. I found part-time bookkeeping work at the feed store in town, 40 minutes each way, because it was the only job that used the one skill anybody had ever complimented me on. And at night, at our own kitchen table, I started keeping the Pruitt Farms books properly for the first time in its history, out of an old composition notebook, because nobody ever had before. I want to mention Loretta here, because she's a real reason I didn't leave that first year, back when I thought about it more than I've ever admitted to anyone besides Eli. Loretta owned nothing my mother would have called anything: a double wide behind the main house, a garden, a church dress she'd had since before I was born, and she showed up at my door that first Christmas with a pie and sat at my table for 2 hours asking real questions about my real life, the first person in this entire arrangement who had. My own mother mailed a card that year with a $20 bill folded inside and a note that read, "Hope you're settling in." I still have both, the pie tin and the card. I've always been the kind of person who keeps things. By our second spring, Eli had noticed I still missed my family Sunday dinners, even the awful ones, and without ever announcing it, he started a small tradition of his own, driving me into town every other Sunday for pie at a diner near the square, not because he had money to spare on pie yet, because he didn't, but because he'd noticed, and noticing was worth more to me by then than money ever had been. Somewhere in the space between 4 a.m. calving checks and arguing over whether to reseed the east pasture, I fell for my husband the unglamorous way. A little at a time, on purpose, with both of us watching it happen. Everett died the September of our 4th year, a heart attack in the equipment shed on an ordinary Tuesday, and it was Eli who found him. We spent the following weeks doing the specific, unbearable work of clearing out a life, his boots by the door, a coffee can of framing nails, a level with the bubble still dead center after 40 years of use. In the bottom drawer of his dresser, under a folded church suit, I found Everett's old family Bible, and tucked into the book of Ruth, of all places, were 2 folded pages. One was a promissory note in my father's handwriting, dated the March before my wedding, acknowledging a loan of $42,000 from Everett Pruitt, signed by both men, and notarized at the Millbrook County Courthouse. The second was a letter in Everett's own blocky hand, addressed to Eli, dated 4 months after that. The same month my parents first floated the idea of a marriage. I sat on the edge of that bed a long while before I showed my husband. When I finally did, he read it twice, standing in his father's bedroom in his father's church suit, and didn't say much of anything for a minute. Then he read one line out loud, slow, like he was checking he'd understood it correctly. Everett had written that he didn't feel right about what Walter was suggesting, that a man ought to choose his own wife and not have one handed to him against a debt, and that he intended to tell Walter so, plainly, the next time he saw him. Whether he did or didn't, it clearly didn't matter, because 2 months later, my father told me the Pruitts were expecting this marriage, that it was already settled, and that backing out now would shame the very family that had saved ours. Never knew about the money, Eli said finally. Knew something about the timing didn't sit right. Didn't know there was a number attached to me. He wasn't angry at me, and that surprised me at the time, because it would have been easy for him to be. He was angry in the specific, quiet way Eli gets angry, which meant he went and checked on the cattle earlier than usual and didn't bring it up again for 3 days. When he finally did, he said one thing I've held on to ever since. Your daddy bought a decision that wasn't his to sell. Doesn't mean what we've built on top of it isn't ours. I kept both papers in a firebox behind the winter coats. I've always been the kind of person who keeps things. It would matter more than I understood, sitting on the edge of that bed. Quick pause here, because I know some of you are already doing the math on how a family gets from a grocery sack loan to the number I opened with. It gets there, and it's not the part you're expecting. If you've ever kept your own quiet records on your own family, go ahead and subscribe now so you don't lose this one halfway through. All right, back to it. For a long stretch, the Pruitt farm made just enough money to keep a family fed and never quite enough to get one ahead. Eli and his father had always run cattle and a modest stand of corn, the same thin margins every farm on Sourwood Pike was fighting over. What changed, slowly, was the back 40. That's where the sourwood trees grew wild, the ones Everett always called just shade. Eli didn't see shade. He saw sourwood honey, the real kind, the kind that only comes out of a 2-week bloom window in the southern Appalachians and sells for 4 times what clover honey does, if you can find bees willing to work it and buyers who know what they're tasting. He put in his first 8 hives our 3rd summer, more out of stubbornness than any real business plan, and I remember doing the math on a legal pad and telling him honestly that 8 hives wasn't going to save anything. So we didn't stop at 8. Over the following years, we built it the unglamorous way, since nothing in this story happens overnight. More hives, A real farm stand instead of a folding table. Preserves made from the same orchard Everett had always kept for family eating, put up properly and labeled and sold every Saturday at the Millbrook Farmers Market. On a card table, Miss Ardell Voss let us have free for 2 whole seasons because she believed in what we were building before any bank did. A chef in Nashville named Dana Kessler bought 4 jars off that table one Saturday, texted me a week later asking for 20 more, and became our first real wholesale account. I got us our first proper business loan in our 5th year, $8,000 from Russ Tanner at Farmers and Merchants, and he approved it mostly on the strength of my composition notebook ledgers, because there's nothing a small-town banker trusts faster than a farmer's wife who can actually show her math. That was the same year the federal farm bill finally made hemp legal to grow again, for the first time since the early 1970s, and Eli put 12 acres into it the following spring, certain it was the break we've been chasing. For about 18 months, it looked like he was right. Then the CBD market flooded. Prices collapsed by more than half in a single season, and we came within one bad harvest of losing the equipment loan we'd taken to plant it. I won't dress that year up for you. We ate a lot of beans. I picked up extra bookkeeping clients in town just to cover the gap, and there were nights I ran the numbers on that hemp acreage and landed somewhere I didn't want to say out loud to my own husband. We didn't quit. We sold half the hemp equipment at a loss, went back to what actually worked, the honey, the preserves, a growing list of restaurants across Nashville and Chattanooga who wanted something with a real story attached, and by year 8, we'd finally built something with a name of its own. Sourwood Hollow. Eli's idea for the name. Mine for nearly everything else. The label design, the wholesale pricing, the spreadsheet that finally told us, for the first time in that farm's whole history, exactly which 20 acres were making money and which 40 were just tradition dressed up as work. The bigger money, when it finally arrived, came from 2 directions at once, and neither one of them was luck. The first was land. A distribution hub went up off the interstate about 9 miles from us in our 9th year, and within 18 months, every open acre in the county started drawing interest it had never drawn before. Cumberland Solar Partners came asking about our back 90, the rocky, low-yield stretch we'd never farmed to begin with, and offered a 25-year lease, an upfront payment north of $1 million, plus a guaranteed sum every year after that. I read every page of that contract twice before I let my husband sign a single one, the same way I've read every page of every contract for 11 years, because I am, and have always been, the kind of person who reads the whole page. The second was Sourwood Hollow itself. A natural grocery distributor out of Atlanta called Amberlight Foods had been carrying our preserves in a handful of stores for 2 years when their acquisitions team called, this past January, about buying the brand outright, the label, the recipes, the wholesale contracts, all of it, with Eli and me staying on as paid consultants for 3 years. The number we landed on, after 4 months of back and forth, mostly conducted by email from the same kitchen table, was $6.4 million. Add the solar lease, the land itself, appreciated now to something like $11,000 an acre along the road frontage alone, the equipment, the house we'd finally been able to fix properly, and a financial planner in Chattanooga, helping us set up a trust for our daughter, was the one who said the total number out loud to me directly, sitting across his desk that January. Just over $10 million. I wrote it down on a sticky note out of habit, the way I write down everything, and then sat in his parking lot for a few minutes before I trusted myself to drive home. None of it happened because of a lottery ticket or an inheritance or luck walking through the front door. It happened because a man nobody in my family thought was worth the gas money to visit spent 11 years reading everything he could find about sourwood trees, and because his wife never once stopped keeping the books. The Millbrook Courier ran a short piece on the Amberlight deal in early February, 3 paragraphs on page 6 next to the school lunch menu, the sort of story that would ordinarily be gone by Thursday. It wasn't, because a food writer at Southern Harvest magazine picked it up off a wire feed and called Eli's cell the following week, asking about a longer feature, the honey, the sourwood, the wife who did the numbers. They scheduled a photographer for the 2nd week of May. Paige saw the Courier piece before I ever mentioned it, forwarded to her by someone from her church group with 3 exclamation points attached, and texted me that same night for the first time in over a year, a message that opened with, "Oh my gosh, Claire," and got, within 4 sentences, to whether Eli had people for the tax side of a sale that size, because Bradley knew a guy. I didn't answer that part. My mother called about 2 weeks after the courier piece ran. Not texted, called, which she hadn't done since Ren's kindergarten graduation, when she left a voicemail asking if we needed a ride because she'd assumed, correctly, that we didn't own a car nice enough for church parking. This time she wanted to know how Ren was doing in school, whether we'd renovated the kitchen ourselves or hired it out, and whether Eli was still doing the honey thing, the exact tone you'd use for someone's hobby. I told her the honey thing was worth several $1,000,000 now. There was a pause on that line I will remember for the rest of my life, and then she asked, carefully, if we'd found ourselves a financial advisor yet, or if that was still up in the air. Eli and I had talked about this exact possibility more than once over the years, the way you talk about a storm the weather service keeps mentioning, but that hasn't actually formed yet. We'd agreed, without ever needing to write it down, that if the day came, we'd just tell the truth and let the numbers speak for themselves. I hadn't expected the storm to reach for the exact same figure twice. 2 days after that phone call, my father drove out unannounced on a Tuesday morning, my mother beside him in a blazer with the tag still folded into the cuff, and asked his son-in-law for $42,000 to cover a roof claim on the Main Street building, a building his own insurance agency, ironically, hadn't carried quite enough coverage on. I want to walk you through exactly how that morning went, because I've thought about it more than almost anything else in these 11 years. They came in through the mudroom, the way family does, though I noted, in the specific way I noticed things, that it had been over 2 years since either of them had used that particular door. My mother admired the granite. My father sat at the head of the table like it was still his to sit at the head of, and after 10 minutes of church gossip and a compliment about Ren's height that he delivered like he'd rehearsed it in the truck on the way out, he set both hands flat on the table, the exact posture he uses before explaining a deductible, and said the roof on Main Street had failed in the March storm, that the policy on his own building had lapsed 8 months earlier during a cash crunch nobody needed to know about, and that $42,000 would make it whole with 2 days to spare before the county condemned the structure. It's not charity, he said. It's family. Family helps family. Lord knows I did. I let that sentence sit in the room a beat longer than was comfortable, waiting to see if he heard it the way I did. He didn't. You drove 40 minutes for a number, I said. My mother said I always did land on my feet. Guess they should have seen it coming. She's been handing me compliments with the pin still in for as long as I can remember. Eli didn't say anything yet. He'd learned a long time ago that this particular fight, whenever it finally came, belonged to me. I want to show you something, I said, and went to the firebox I keep behind the winter coats, the same one I carried out of that first farmhouse closet and into this one, and brought back 2 pieces of paper, setting them on the table between the biscuits my mother hadn't touched. That's Everett's handwriting. That's your signature at the bottom. $42,000. The March before I married Eli, notarized at the county courthouse. I found it in Everett's Bible 4 years into my marriage, after he passed, tucked into the book of Ruth, which I've never quite decided was an accident or not. I set the second page down on top of it. That's a wire transfer confirmation. I paid this off in full 4 years ago out of the farm account. You didn't know that, because I never told you. There's no debt, Dad. There hasn't been one in 4 years. There's just a story you kept telling because it sounded better than the truth, which is that you traded your daughter to protect your own license. My father's face did something I'd never once seen it do in 32 years of watching it, which was nothing at all. He didn't have a follow-up ready. My mother reached out and touched the note like touching it might change what it said. There's more to it, I said. A letter Everett wrote to Eli. One Eli didn't get to read until after his father was already gone. Everett didn't want this marriage bought with his money, Dad. He told you that, directly, before it ever happened. He told you a man should choose his own wife. You told me the Pruitts were already expecting this, that it was settled, that saying no would shame the family that saved ours. None of that was true. Eli didn't know a dollar figure was attached to him until I showed him that letter myself, right here at this table, 6 years ago. She's right, Eli said. It was the first thing he'd said since they'd walked in. Didn't know any of it. Wouldn't have wanted it if I had. My mother recovered fast, faster than almost anyone I've ever known, and pivoted the way she's always been better at than anyone I've ever met. She asked, gently now, whether there might be room for family in the magazine piece, said it would mean a great deal to her to be included, that people at church had already started asking. The writer asked me the same thing last week, I said. I told her there was an extended family in this story. I'm not going to be the twist in a comeback you didn't earn. For the first time in 32 years, I watched my mother open her mouth and have nothing ready to fill it. They left without the check and without a promise about the magazine. My father's jaw set the exact way it used to get right before he'd stopped speaking to me for a month at a stretch when I was a teenager. My mother folding herself into the passenger seat like the blazer had somehow gotten heavier since she'd put it on that morning. Neither one said goodbye to Eli by name. Wren came down the stairs about 10 minutes later, having heard exactly none of it and somehow all of it, the way kids always do. She asked if Grandma was coming to her 4-H chicken judging in June. I told her, honestly, that I didn't know, that Grandma had a lot going on right now, the true version, the gentle one, the one that doesn't make an 8-year-old carry a grown woman's choices around in her chest. Wren thought about that the serious way she thinks about most things, then decided she'd mail Grandma a picture of the chickens anyway, because maybe she'd still like to see them, even if she can't come. I have never in my life wanted to sit down on my own kitchen floor and cry the way I wanted to right then, and I'll be honest, I did a little, once she'd gone back upstairs. Paige texted twice more over the following month. The second time she asked, without much of a lead-up, whether I could talk some sense into our parents about the roof, since apparently I was good with that kind of thing now. I told her I hoped, someday, our parents figured out how to want us for reasons that didn't come with a dollar sign attached. I never heard back. I didn't expect to. The magazine piece ran that May, 4 pages, a photo of Eli up to his knees in sourwood blossom, and one of me at the same kitchen table with the old composition notebook, retired to a shelf now because everything runs through a real accountant these days, though I kept it anyway. I've always been the kind of person who keeps things. The article named Eli's parents, Everett and Loretta, right there in print. It never mentioned mine. I never gave the writer a reason to ask. Some evenings I still sit at this table and go through the books out of habit more than necessity, and Eli comes in from the barn and makes 2 cups of coffee even though it's 8 at night, because neither of us has ever slept well right after a long day, and we go over nothing in particular, the hive count, whether the equipment shed needs a new roof before winter, ordinary things. My parents and I never once, in 32 years, managed a conversation that didn't circle back to what I owed somebody. My father's roof, as far as I know, still isn't fixed. I think about that less than you might expect. I used to believe my parents would come around on their own eventually, the way you believe a light will turn green if you just wait long enough at an empty intersection. What I understand now is that some people only come back once the math changes in your favor, and calling that a reunion is its own quiet kind of lie. An apology I never got isn't a wound I'm still nursing. It's just a fact I've filed away, the way I file everything, somewhere I can find it again if I ever actually need it. Family, in my experience, was never the people who share your last name at the bottom of a promissory note. It was a woman who showed up with a pie on my first Christmas in a house with no heat and asked me real questions at my own table. It was a man who read a letter about himself in his dead father's handwriting and decided it changed nothing about what he'd already chosen to build with me. Family is who stays before there's anything in it for them. So here's what I keep turning over, and I'd honestly like to know where you land on it. If the people who raised you disappeared the moment you had nothing, and only found their way back once you had something, would you ever let them all away in again? And if you did, how would you tell the difference between forgiveness and just being useful again? Tell me in the comments. If this one hit close to home, go ahead and subscribe. I read every single comment, and I'll see you in the next one.